Okay, thanks a lot, and thanks to the Observatory for having invited me. And I really hope there will be a chance to do something similar in person soon. And of course, after such a presentation, I have the only option of disappointing you a bit because he has been too good. But what I'll try to do, hopefully, is providing you an overview of a job which is very much in the making at the moment, which is I'm working together with Martina Zeiner, that I will quote several times, to a project in making together and placing a consistent theoretical framework, a huge amount of recent research on sexuality and migration, which is at the moment fragmented in many different fields. So what I'll try to do today is mostly to give a very basic overview of the fields in which sexuality and migrations are important keywords, together with a rationale for studying sexuality and migration together, and with certain ideas on the kind of theoretical framework which could help establishing a cumulative field out of a lots of fragmented good ideas, let's say. Now, first of all, I need to justify my claim that sexuality or immigration, or sexual migration as some people call it, are a growing area of interest for research in migration. And I think I can do it thanks to Google, as usual, what we would do without Google nowadays, which has this marvelous program which basically uses the enormous amount of books published, scannerized by Google, and give you the frequency of certain terms. As you can see, then starting, let's say, in the 90s, but particularly after in the last 20 years, the number of works concerning sexual migration, or at least better, mentioning sexual migration in their text, has been increasing quite a bit. Of course, it's still a very niche interest. You can see from the percentage on the side, but there are no doubt that these have been increasing. And I say so because in the growing number of reviews of people working on sexuality and migration, usually the first sentence of the review is, "This is a completely radically new field and nobody has ever worked on that." And that's not true. People have worked on that even without calling it in this way. And for sure, in the last 2 decades, there are many scholars working only or partially over it. Growing numbers don't mean anyway a unified or somewhat a conversation in which people can participate. Because if you look at the references, after having seen that the reference exists, and I did it as long as I could, even if they're now in the tens of thousands of reference, using Google Scholar, you get that 90% of this literature are mostly social problem literature, mostly dealing either with sex work or with trafficking of women, which are, of course, very important humanitarian issues, but are not precisely the center of what I consider an interest on the role that sexuality plays in migration and the role of that migration plays in sexual change. Let's say there is a very large part of the available literature which is mostly focused on only these two fields, and there are a few works and on more analytically, let's say, less policy-oriented issues, and there are lots of references in works devoted to something else. And still, I don't want to be provocative, but migration sexualities are very contentious issues all over Europe. Both those who oppose migrant and those who somewhat support a more liberal migration policies use sexualized topics of many different kinds. usually to stigmatize migrants, sometimes not to stigmatize them, sometimes even to exalt them. I'm just saying that we don't work on the sexual dimension of migration, but the sexual dimension of migration is very important actually politically in many ways. You know, as example, that public opinion in Germany switched during 2015-16 very quickly from being pro-migrant to be against the refugees after the night in Cologne, where group of people, among them certain number of refugees, disturbed or groped girls at the night. You remember that night is one of the few cases in which public opinion really changed quickly, as example. And clearly the issue there was an issue of gender equality, but was also an issue which very often played on stereotypes on the horny refugees and whatever. If you see in this picture on the other side, that's what seems to be a party, a hippie party, is actually, I think still today, I just checked, part of the videos that all migrants wanting to have a residence in the Netherlands, wanting to get a visa for a long-term residence visa to go to the Netherlands, usually because they're married, have to watch in order to file up the requirements for a visa. And in this video, there are explained, among other things, that in the Netherlands, people can marry or kiss in the street people of the same gender, or can stay in this kind of rave parties and whatever. Which again is a way of saying, of filtering migrants according to the stereotypes that migrants are sexually repressed, or at least they need to know that if they go, they will suffer some kind of shocks. While below you get, I take it from the website, but I also checked this morning, the website is still there, for a German website, which does a very important role in providing sexual information for migrants in 15 languages, I think, which is actually a website for sexual therapists and professionals of the sex, in the sense that provide language translation of key terms and whatever, but it's actually used by tens of thousands of people. And it's a very controversial website, because from one side, people praise it for the enlightened guidance it offers, but other migration activists criticize it as paternalistic or as reinforcing stereotypes, like migrants need this kind of information because they're ignorant about very basic things like sexual positions or whatever. I'm not claiming that any of these cases which I suggested you or those boys being drunk around or whatever is a key epiphany of what I'm going to say. I just want to stress that these are small examples of the fact that when we talk of interaction with migrants and whatever, there is often a sexual undertones which would be useful to bring to the fore and discuss openly rather than keep implicit. The problem is we don't have very much data on that. What has been shocking when I started being interested in this field is that, okay, I was accustomed when I was young, and Joao was also young, of how few data on migration were. But along the years, now there are too many data on migration, more or less. I cannot analyze all them all. Sexuality is still like it was migration a long time ago. There is very few data on migration and sex. There are a certain number, not many surveys or ethnographies of sexual life in our countries, but there are not much data. What I found after, I like library work, so I looked around, is basically there are a few ethnographic analyses, not as many as you would expect. There are a few surveys of sexual behavior, which are mostly done not by sociologists or economists or demographers, but mostly by epidemiologists, the new leading discipline of the social sciences, mostly because, as I will argue, sexual migration and sexuality and migration have an impact on the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, and so they've been studied in this context. There is an astonishing amount of very good historical work, because the issue of sexual change and migration has been at the center of early modern European historian for a long time. There are retrospective life histories and very few reports from clinical practice. What we have been trying to do in this year is putting together all this material, which is not much, and trying to read them together rather than as single issues. And the question is why we are doing it, and why we think more people should do it, more or less. And the reason, I think, is very simple. I think that studying sexual change brought about migration is a perfect way, it's a strategic research material to study questions which are really at the center of the social sciences. Because first of all, I mean, what does a migration scholar does mostly? Try to understand how much the experience of geographical mobility modifies the basic attitudes of human beings. Do people change migrating, or do people stay the same? Which, in the case of one of the most intimate spheres of individual life, is a perfect case to study. And given that in current world culture, sexual life is very much taken as a proxy of your authentic self, of the most authentic self. Studying if this changes with migration is very much a way to try to answer the key question of the field. Do people change when geographical conditions change? So, and in which direction? Because this is usually the second question of the social science. Is the environment that change people, or is the people who change environment? In this case, if we could prove that migration modify sexual behaviors and worldview, we would have a good argument in favor of the importance of the social sciences. And the third is a variation of the first two questions. These three questions, as I will argue, are questions on individuals and environment, more or less, the great distinction of the social sciences. But there is another one which is more cultural and is equally important. What I would claim is that we should study sexuality also because sexuality reveals how international mobility participate and contribute to global sociocultural change. So I would move from the individual to the collective, to the, let's say, individual level to group level reactions. And I would try to argue, I will at the end of this talk, that the importance of studying sexuality migration is also that migration is very often a migration through an ethnosexual boundary. And so it modifies it. I don't want to bore you too much, but this is basically my desperate attempt to prove my colleagues that what I'm doing is not weird, which is taking what you do in sociology is usually taking a founding father and showing that the founding father was also interested in what you are interested in. And in my case, the founding father is Max Weber in person, the tutelar god of sociology. And as you can see from these four quotations, I can prove that it's right. Actually, the young Max Weber, as you probably know, was studying Polish migrant to Prussia, was the first empirical research he ever did. And there is a fascinating footnotes in one of his, I like footnotes, I usually read more footnotes than text, but there is a fascinating footnotes in text in which he say, maybe one day we will make a survey of sexual frequency to understand from there if migrants are more stressed than the local populations or not, which I thought was brilliant because it was like 1904 or something like that. And the guy was already thinking that he could use sexual information to make general case of, but that's another matter. What I want to stress is simply that the general approach by Max Weber is fully consistent with my studies, and that he also claimed that sociology should be interested in sexual love, what he calls sexual love from one side, and sexual life, including a cultural dimension. And of course, if it's work for sociology as such, does it work also for sociology of migration, I guess? But and the second, if sociology is one side, sexology or sexual sciences or whatever, I mean, the discipline is a discipline with thousands of people, mostly working in the biosciences. Is another concept that I'm going to use along this talk, that is erotic plasticity. When sexologists talk about erotic plasticity, they mean the degree to which behavior or drive can be changed by cultural or social factors. It's a huge debate. Actually, probably is the most heated debate nowadays in sex. If you look at journal like the Archive of Sexual Behavior, you will get 2 or 3 papers every month on that. Mostly because there is a huge debate on the role of gender in sexual plasticity. As far as we know, the evidence seems to point out that women are usually more plastic than men. But of course, there are people who claim that this has biological sources, and there are people who claim that these has cultural sources. And of course, there is not data to be completely sure that actually this is true. But for this literature has shown that there are large variation in sexual desire and behavior in different times, situations, stage of life, and whatever. But interestingly, they never focused on mobility as one of the factors for this variation, and this is what I would like to do it here. I also want to stress that when we talk of erotic plasticity, taking it from psychological and biological sense, we don't mean sexual fluidity, which is a completely different concept, also very popular, which means basically people switching sexual orientation in their life course. It's another important phenomenon, but it's not the phenomenon we are dealing with. So we don't deal with people that through migration become either heterosexual or bisexual or homosexual and whatever, but with people that within the broad sexual orientation as a plastic attitude encounter modifies the stuff. These are basically the dimensions of possible sexual change. This is not original. Let's say we synthesized a huge amount of debates that uses different languages. So I'm not sure that these languages maps perfectly the one you may have in your mind, but I hope it's clear. There is a dimension of change in sexual orientation, which is with whom you desire or you have sex. There is a sexual motivation, why you make sex. There is a sexual script dimension, which you can change, which is basically the cultural element of what can be expected or what can be done during a sexual interaction. And of course, you can change lots of this element. There are possible changes in sexual practices of performance, which means on how you dream or you make sex. There are possible changes in what I call the sexual accountability. In other words, to whom and how you have to justify your desire and your action. Something that we know from psychoanalysis and literature is that very often, nearly always, sex has also a meaning and need to be justified somewhat. People don't want only to say I desire, but I want to say that they are right in desiring what they do. And finally, there is the issue of changes in sexual subculture, how similar and how different and how collective is the stuff you are. I just mapped this different dimension because one of the reasons for which many of the current debate is a dialogue among deaf is precisely because people use similar terms to be interested in different things and end up having several problems. So why these changes should take into account mobility experiences? Well, there are several reasons, but the reasons, and they are different reasons, and they should be studied differently, is first of all that you can have sexual themes in the reason for migration, mobility. I mean, you may decide to migrate for reasons which are linked to your sexual desire and orientation. Actually, this is quite common, as you will argue. Well, quite common, I mean, it's relatively common. But a second possibility is that sexual venues may be a channel for mobility. That you migrate for something else, but through migration, you are exposed to stimuli and drives which are different from what you would expect. A third element is that settlement or incorporation, call it as you want, putting roots in a new context implies various forms of sexual change. The most evident one, if you meet someone during the settlement process and you start a family, and probably that's people surely different from what you experienced before, but can be also other issues. A fourth way is basically that through migration, people which are stereotyped in different way arrives in a new environment, and they give usually rise to what I call the sexual orders or sexual stratification. A group of people who are collectively identified with certain form of sexual life or with certain form of sexual aspiration, which place them in a certain pecking order in the marriage market or the sexual market of the place they are. And finally, migration policies itself are often shaped by normative vision of the sexually appropriate. We know, for example, that asylum policies have been difficulties for a long time to recognize sexual orientation as a reason for persecution. It's still today a very complex issue, and thousands of legal people are working on issues like, do trans which have not been do not want to go through surgery be recognized as trans people and be protected by asylum laws, or they shouldn't? Or other issues like, well, I can make also other issues. Multiple marriages or polyamoric arrangements are not usually covered by reunification family policies, as example. And they are not only, and there are people complaining about that, not only in the Muslim community, but also among, let's say, the most liberal and radical sexual parts, which claim that they should be free to have different family arrangements without being discriminated for these migration policies. They may sound extreme claim, but they exist, and they are useful, let's say, in scholarly terms, so much to understand that neutral migration policies very often are embedded in certain notion of the cultural appropriate. In my work and in the work of many others, I would say it would be very useful to distinguish these three dimensions, which are the three dimensions I'm talking today. Sexual migrations, which with this term, I mean migration which are motivated by sexual reasons. The sexual dimension of migration, I refer mostly to sexual change triggered by migration, which was not, as far as we know, intentionally motivated by that. And these two are forms of individual change, let's say, even if it may involve several people at the same time. While the third dimension is what I called ethno-sexual boundaries and migrating landscapes, which is the change in the sexual culture of a place owing to the arrival of partners or potential partners which are not part of the category which or the pre-established system of sexual categories existing in the place. Allora, the first, which apparently is also the most well-studied of sexual migration, is actually as old as urbanization itself. That's the reason for which I mentioned in the beginning historian of early modern Europe, because among them it's not a secret that urbanization was accompanied very often by a selectivity, in the sense that people belonging to sexual minority would mostly try to move from rural areas to cities, because cities offered a much more protective environment for people of sexual minorities, and because sexual minorities are minorities, they are smaller as sites. And so they could find much more easily partners in a larger urban structure rather than in a rather small villages or set of villages. Plus, privacy issues, of course, were much easier to deal with in urban life than in rural area. And there are lots of studies, I think, about those studies on Venice or Amsterdam, the global cities of the past, stressing that there were this selectivity in the migration process. So it's nothing new. But as you can remember from the picture, San Francisco played a very important role in the gay movement in the US, precisely because it was the city to which gay would migrate. And they would migrate mostly because they knew that they could enjoy a more open and welcoming environment there than they would in even larger cities. So the three reasons which urban historians have identified for this process, population density, a specialized infrastructure, and a more liberal climate, do still work in this sense. And they give already a powerful example of what mobility is important for, and why sexuality can be a powerful drive for migration, which is something that we are still witnessing on the global scale. If you look at this very up-to-date map, is December 2020, which has been done basically mapping country by country the level of either discrimination or protection from discrimination for same-sex individuals or individuals having a same-sex sexuality. You can easily see that there are clear, marked, sharp geographical differences, and that for many people, the chances of having a relatively safer sexual life implies the possibility of moving to a country or another. There has been a set of studies, mostly by Slavic scholars in the UK, as example, on the migration of gay and lesbian from the former USSR to the United Kingdom, which were somewhat often, maybe not completely or exclusively, but very frequently justified by fear of discrimination or fear of, let's say, bad experiences, even really bad experiences in the Russian Federation, particularly with the worsening climate for gay and lesbian. And the same applies to Sudan, to most of Africa and whatever. There is good reason for which what I noticed about rural-urban migration applies today also to the international scale of migration. So this is clearly a case which is not particularly troublesome from the point of view of migration theory, in the sense we know that people migrate for many reasons. One of the reasons is the fact that they want to enjoy a safer life. But there is another dimension which is least studies and which is much more complex to study, which is actually those of the people who experience changes in their sexual lives or desires or whatever, owing to migration and after migration, or in the course of migration. In other words, the cases which most people working, let's say, in gay and queer and lesbian studies seems to ignore, or people who experience significant sexual change unintentionally, when migration is not motivated by that, at least not openly or unconsciously. Of course, we don't know what is the unconscious of people. And here, if you look at the various evidence which have been collected mostly by ethnographers, you get very complete, very contrasting findings in a way. Because there are cases which have been well studied and reported in which settlement is associated to a serious reduction in sexual activities and even desire. Is the classical case which has been studied over and over there of, as example, guest workers migration in the 70s and 80s across Europe, among Italian and Portuguese among them, which knew that moving would be associated for a long while to period of protracted solitude, in a way. There is also a very good book by a doctor bound to become a famous French writer, which is called La plus haute des solitudes, and it's about the solitude, the sexual solitudes of North African migrants in France. At the same time, there are accounts and there are studies which say that is migration, particularly in the early stage, is actually associated with the opposite, with enhanced sexual activities and enhanced desire and enhanced experimentation, which I can witness, having done one of this research, is for certain group accurate. The survey we carried out with Eastern European women in northeastern Italy said that basically many of them had more sexual partners in the years after migration that they had in all their previous life. But my point is, these are specific cases and you cannot create you should ask why in certain cases happens a certain stuff and why in others happens different things. And I'll provide some hypotheses afterwards. But this is clearly a connection. If you look through the evidence, you get very opposite cases, very contrasting cases. And the same when you look at the subcultures. In other words, studies shows process of strong sexual acculturation. In other words, adoption of the sexual norms of the places where you're settling, but also there are cases of markedly distinctive sexual culture, of resistance, as called in the cultural studies jargon. And they often come from the same origin point. So there must be something in the settlement process which bifurcates people. And this is stronger because this is based on relatively strong surveys. Migrants in certain places and countries and migration systems are lowly associated with STDs. In other words, they have less risks than the other population, and in other places they are associated with much higher risks. So there is something in the structure of the migration networks and of the migration process which makes a difference. And I would start from the last, from the STD case, simply because this has been the most studied, again, by historians, not only by sociologists and whatever, because migration has always been associated with diffusion of sexually transmitted diseases since its very beginning. As you can see, Venice, the global cities of the Renaissance, was one of the cases in which helped that contributed to the spread of syphilis across Western Europe. And historians have tried to explain why. They basically found three hypotheses. We're talking of hypotheses here. First of all, from all over Europe, there were young and unmarried people migrating to Venice. Second, Venice had a very specific sexual culture, which was more liberal than other cities. The church had less influences, and as long as you could make a good profit, the government was leaving brothels and other institutions open. And the Venetian patriciate was enjoying a much larger level of privileges, both in economic and power terms, so they could lead, and they would lead, a much more debauched life than ruling elites of other cities. These three factors, according to them, explains why people would go to Venice, get infected, return to their place, or move to another place and carry the illnesses with this. But which is a very gruesome element, the sexual transmitted disease, is important because it's a hard proof of the importance of migration in this scheme. What I say is there is other changes are maybe sociologically more important, and likely they are also more pleasant for the people involved, because migration may produce change in practices and behavior, what in sexological studies are called sexual learning. You learn new things in the ways of relationship, in roles and identities. And what is important, many of this change may take place also in sending communities, thanks to migration. There's a very interesting demographer, Jennifer Hirsch, which has written what I think is one of the best books in the sexuality of migration stuff on Mexican migrants in the US and Mexico. And she has basically shown a certain model of companion marriages have basically been acculturated in the US and returned with returning migrants to sending communities, becoming or diffusing or dominant also in sending communities. So these changes imply that some move, but not necessarily that all the impacted people move. And so why we have these different very different impacts and consequences and processes? What I would argue, and I'm very looking at your questions and criticism afterwards, is that basically no universal trend emerge, but there are clearly some factors which seems important to explain why processes goes in one direction on one other. And some of these arguments are very neatly presented in this book, which is by my main co-author, Martina Zweiner, which happens also to be my wife. So I've got a conflict of interest in trying to persuade you to read the book, but it's a really nice book, and it provides evidence for some of what I'm going to say here. Well, of course, there are individual factors. Age and sex are the most important ones. Still, remember, age and sex are natural, but they have also some kind of social components. For most women migrating from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, it's also discovered that they are actually younger than they assume, because given the different conception of female age in the two places, there is a process which Russell King and some of his collaborators have studied, in which people who are considered basically old women in their own homeland are actually considered middle-aged women in Western Europe. So, but these are clearly individual factors and are fairly important. The European Thai sexual system, which has been studied over and over, older men migrating to Thailand to find younger wife and living with younger wife, is clearly based on age too. But I think it's much more important migration features. At least in our study, what seems to our important is some elements which usually sexologists and epidemiologists neglect, but sociologists should pay attention to, which is, okay, place of origin is fairly clear. It's not the same thing coming from one continent or another. But it's also important the type of migration system. In other words, a women-led migration system, like the system that brings lots of women from the Philippines or Eastern Europe to the domestic services market of European cities, which often is based on women recruiting other women, with very few recruitment of men. It's clearly a migration system which creates an environment which is completely different from family reunification, in which usually women follows men. And it's completely different from system which couples migrates together. And it's interesting, like, I think the importance of having migration scholar working sexual change is also that this kind of stuff which appears evident to anybody who has ever worked on migration is completely neglected by people working on other fields. If you are in a woman-led migration system, you are, for many reasons explained in this book, in a completely different existential position than if you arrive in a place in which there is already a kinship network settled and other stuff done. And this brings to the third factor, which I would bring your attention to, which is the position in the migration sequence. Not all migrants are the same, that we know it, but also pioneers' migration are not the same of followers. I use the terms of innovation, usually innovation studies, like pioneer, early adopter, and settlers or followers. Now, the women or the men who migrate first, without having a migration infrastructure already in place, have a much harder bargain, but they have also much more freedom. There are no expectations and social controls in place, which is the opposite in the case of followers, which usually have, as we know from migration literature, a much smoother migration path because they arrive in a place where information and services and whatever already exist, but they also part of a community which has already established their own definition of reality. Now, what the difference I observe, I think, are very much linked to studies concerning pioneers towards study concerning followers, as example. Plus, there are several reasons which are linked to incorporation feature, let's say. Well, the degree of anonymity, as example. Migrating to a city is not the same than migrating to a village. Migrating in a situation in which migrants are geographically dispersed is not the same that migrating to a place where you live in the same buildings of most of other migrants, which means that most people from your homeland are basically observing you and you are observing them and whatever. The degree of isolation is another stuff which we should really pay attention to because it's key. And these have been done other studies on friendship and isolation, and what is really astonishing is how much isolation actually migration usually involves. The level of independence, the degree of disruption of social works, of social networks, the changing family and social statuses, and also issue like norm ambiguity, accessibility of spaces, and affordability. There is also another very beautiful book called Erotic Journeys by a sociologist working on Mexican migration again to the US, in which I'm summarizing very brutally the argument. Migrant couples migrating to the US enjoy much freer environment and they become actually much more passionate. Unfortunately, they have to work much more in different places and they have much less time to see each other than they had in Mexico. So what one hand gives, the other hand takes, more or less. This has issue with accessibility and affordability in a way. And let's say my claim, I think it's a very bold claim because we don't have so much evidence, is that this factor more or less explain how people react to different sexual opportunities in the new environments. Other with experimentation, new sexual patterns and schedules, or actually traditionalization, adoption, possibly in the most rigid way of what they're taken to be the norms in the sending countries. A study which has been done in Vietnam, which I also find quite interesting, was explained that basically Vietnam has a huge migration from villages to cities, which has a seasonal pattern, more or less. In the period in which agriculture is not particularly intense, men leave to the city to work in factories and they go back at the beginning of the planting season. And basically what these anthropologists claim is that they become much more traditionally in their expectation towards their wives and towards the family life. because basically they fear that whatever new innovation they bring in their family life will be seen by their wife as a proof that they had new experiences in town, more or less. So they think that whatever new wish or whatever new proposal they would make to their partners would be read as a proof of infidelity, which is a proof how ingenious and complex family life always is, in a way, because I never thought it could be interpreted this way. When I first made this argument here, most people said, but are you sure it's not just the place from you come from? In other words, are you sure that it's not origin only? And actually, we know that sexual cultures are very much shaped and clustered in the world, and they are really markedly different. So this is a real hypothesis that I should not rule out. But the problem is, I think we have some good reason to doubt that origins is everything. The first is that, as we know, migration is always a selection. It's never a reproduction of, it's not a representative sample of the sending population. And as we already know from history, whatever, as example, the composition by sexual orientation of the migrants is likely to be different than the one from the general population. The second is that there are differences in living conditions, and we expect difference in living condition implies some possible changes, at least of people desiring something which they couldn't afford in their home country. There are differences in migration always imply difference in social statuses, and again, this should imply difference in possibilities, positively or negatively, to pursue their own sexual project. There are clearly differences in infrastructures. The possibility of accessing a wide variety of sexual opportunities and services in certain countries completely different from another, and in certain urban areas in comparison to other urban areas. So I would expect that at least one element of change would be provided by the changing of environment. And finally, also origin cultures are ambivalent and redundant. The stereotypes that each continent or place or ethnic group or whatever has a single sexual norms or sexual culture or sexual desire is definitely wrong, in the sense that anthropological knowledge seems to point out that there are always more opportunities or more alternatives than can be actualized. And finally, the very fact that migration usually imply protracted phases of isolation and loneliness make me think that there are, in migration, as a norm, of course, I'm not claiming that all migrants experience loneliness and isolation, and I'm not claiming that all people experiencing loneliness and isolation have practice or experiment with different forms of sexual life, but we could say that both are true on average for a large chunk of the population. And again, epidemiologists seem to stress the loneliness has an impact in lowering the threshold of risk that people are willing to accept in their sexual life, being sexuality also a way of gaining recognition and psychological well-being. If you wonder what the picture is, that picture has been made in Milan in 1960s and concerned mostly southern Italian immigrants to the city, but you could easily apply to, I guess, also today. Okay, so here I said what I think and what I study and what I think people should study of sexuality and migration at the individual level, in the way in which it changes either migration because it's driven by sexual consideration, or sexual life if it's driven by mobility. But I do not believe that migration is ever a private or individual things. We may like it or not, it's always also a collective things, and there is always kind of collective categorical thinking influencing and acting on our sexual lives. Let's say, as a writer, which I don't remember, which has said, he said basically sex life is much more a narrative than an act, in the sense that also act is mostly narrated and can be dissociated from narration. Okay, the problem is in some of this narration is clearly anthropologically made by the fact that ethnic boundaries and different ethnic differences are nearly always eroticized, perceived in terms of difference in erotic natures, erotic behavior. I found this quotation by Nagel, which is Boston historian and the cultural theorist, which I usually don't like cultural studies, but I think this statement is pretty much accurate. And I quote here a few stereotypes, which are, I guess, well known in Portugal, exactly like are well known in Italy, just in order to make the claim, which I said, that whatever ethnic boundary we cross is usually also a sexualized or eroticized boundaries. Our conception of ethnic difference is nearly always a conception of also differences in the way we. Why does it? Sorry, but yeah. So basically, the argument would be that migration is distinguished from mobility and from any other thing by the fact that in migration, people cross a boundary. We are accustomed to the idea to cross an international or administrative boundaries, but again, historians have taught us that you can talk also about ethnocultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries, and whatever. Well, my argument is crossing these boundaries, very often you cross also a collectively established sexual boundary. And that's explained the reason for which, as we saw in the beginning, the sexuality of migrants is such a contentious issue in public debate. And how we should study them? One notion which I found convincing in a way is the idea that these collective categories which define our sexual belonging, call it. When I say sexual belonging, I don't mean that people must feel to be part of a category. I feel it is a socially shared categories that people know exist. So I do not enter into the authentic desire of people as much as the common language and ranking criteria which exist in the public space and in the private space. These categories are never perfectly equal. They are always kind of stratification in which there are different kinds of groups associated with different kinds of sexual desires and practices, which are associated to different level of decency, desirability, prestige, and so on. The picture you see is a very clear case of this kind of stratification, I mean, which comes from a brothel, as you probably may imagine, and it provides in a very kind of market-oriented way different prices for different ethnicity. I thought this picture is a fake. It could be a fake because I downloaded it from a website. But actually, when I did my fieldwork in Cambodia, I've seen exactly signs like this many, many times with completely different groups. Even places with different floors for different, let's say, ethnicities associated with different degrees of luxuries or whatever. I'm not claiming that in Trento or Lisbon or whatever the situation is the same, but there is a sexual stratification which anyway implies the ideas that there are stereotyped attributes which are used to define the desirability of particular partners for particular purposes. And some of this stratification may be also largely independent from other types of stratification, like the usual ones, money, power, and prestige, and so on. And basically, migrants which arrives in this sexual stratification, of course, are outside of it, and they need to struggle to find a place in it. Well, they need to struggle to find a place in it, or they need to defend themselves from the places in the sexual stratification people would like to place them. That's a very different issues. In both cases, they face a field and they need to establish a foothold in the field, even if this field, the foothold means defending from the field. And basically I say we because we're working on it with Martina mostly, we found basically three possibilities or three strategies. I'm not claiming strategies in the sense of rational pursuit. I'm saying just three ways in which reactions are somewhat linked. And I provide you with three examples in the literature which are well known. The first is resistance, as a cultural theorist would say. In other words, I don't want to stay in such classification. I want to establish my own classification in which certain of my elements are valued as decent and prestigious. And Espiritu, in a very interesting paper, wrote basically, tried to explain why Filipinas' mother in the US were trying to teach very strict moral codes to their daughters, not so much for the importance of the moral codes as such, but as way of differentiating them from white girls, basically, which were considered more privileged. And as the sentence, which is also the title of the paper, explains, is we need to distinguish from them in order to be recognized as valuable. We are not as promiscuous and as whatever as them. Another option, which is pretty much common, is what is called the Mexican acculturation or sexual acculturation, which means basically adopting the sexual norms of the receiving country, very often making them a matter of distinction and prestige toward the sending country. In other words, to be more emancipated, more modern, more equal, more to whatever. And the third, which we call hybridity, which is not a nice word, actually, if you find a better word, please tell us, is basically the process which you also observe in a given context, in which members of the migrating group, which basically are against or are oppressed or feel the pressure, both of the majority and minority sexual subculture, establish something which merge element of both. In the case of the study by Mana Lanzan, it was mostly a study of gay Filipinos, which were basically appropriating element of the Filipino tradition, merging with the gay subculture of the US, in order to basically create a liminal space which was nor gay in the Anglo-Saxon term, nor traditional Filipino manhood as in the Filipino community. But to conclude, because I already talked nearly 1 hour, I will conclude with one story, which is one story we had the fortune to observe, more or less, in one ethnographic studies for a fairly long time, and spending lots of time with the person whose story I'm going to tell you, in both in Trento and in her homeland, and with her friends and whatever. So it's a story which we, as far as ethnographer may claim to be sure, is fairly sure. And this is somewhat I find a story which is interesting in order, I call it the birth of an ethnic minority, which is a big claim, but is something, well, Kay, which is a woman, is actually, yeah, is now 28, so she's a woman. When we met, the heir was around 16 originally, and she just recently arrived to Trento with family reunification. And the story we are telling starts a couple of years later when she's around 18. And what was striking us as ethnographer was the fact that she was a very nice person. She had good Italian, much better than, of course, first generation after 5 years, but she was not having one single Italian friend, more or less. Or of course, she had classmates and whatever, but whenever we saw her, she was always with other Ukrainian or Moldovan young people, which was strange because her mother, which we also knew and was a very influential person in the, at the time, recently growing Eastern European community in Trento, was actually, like most of the first generation women, having friends, both Italian and Ukrainian, and also lots of friends of other different nationalities and whatever, in, let's say, in the immigrant community. While Kay was, and as we knew her, we noticed that she was dating some boyfriend across the years, and they were all people from Eastern European background, which was interesting because her mother was always disparaging Eastern European people, calling them drunkards and whatever. So she wasn't really happy that her daughters actually was always with whatever. And we quoted 2 references she made to explain us when we asked why she was always dating Eastern European guys. One of her great moments in her life were basically spending the summer in her homeland, and actually we usually also spent part of the summer in the same place, just in order to follow the people we were following. And she was obviously at 18 quite happy to be there. Actually, she was feeling home there. And in a few months, we were meeting for breakfast. Usually, she was basically becoming increasingly critical over time. First of her girlfriends, which, according to her, as you probably see, they were not particularly positive judgments of their way of dressing and behaving, and also of the fact that they were basically pulling her leg all the time, on the fact that she didn't find an Italian lover or Italian boyfriend full of money, of course. And so also her male friend became over time drunkards, boring, and the disco were old-fashioned, there was nothing to do there, internet doesn't really connect well, and all the other stuff. And one morning, which was one morning toward the end of the summer, she basically was very incensed by the fact that a local boy had made an unwanted pass on her. Well, apparently the problem was not that he had made this unwanted pass, although had been pretty rude, but the fact that when she had basically put him in his place, she had the feeling that he had been rude with her, mostly because had taken for granted that living in Italian, she had been an easy girl, more or less. And even worse, when she said no and put him in his place, he basically reacted, pulling her leg and saying, "Staying in Italy has made you a lesbian." Stuff that she didn't like at all. And what we noticed is that, I don't think this event, but the set of events of that summer explained why the summer afterwards, there was a striking difference in the sense that she wasn't wearing anymore like an Eastern European teenager, but was wearing strictly, rigidly, and in any occasion as an Italian teenager, which until then had been heavily criticized by her as lacking style and femininity. And even more when we realized that she keeps wearing let's say, hyper-feminine dressing at the Ukrainian parties in Italy, while she wears strictly Italian dressing in Ukraine. And we observe it also later in other summers. In other words, and that's the reason for which I see how sexuality here contributed to, or sexual themes, has nothing to do with their sexual behavior, but has more to do with the sex as a communication element, a communication theme, has contributed to create an ethnic minority, in the sense she's not a diaspora, she's not transnational anymore, because she's basically severed all links with her country, but she still keeps a distinctive identity in her new place, which is now having her married and having children here, probably her definite place. Let's say I conclude with a proof that the way which people think and talk about sex is also very important in establishing migrant identities. I'm looking forward to your questions.